Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Behind Company Lines podcast. Today we have Colin Johnson, CEO and co-founder of Freeport, a platform bringing fine art investment on chain. Colin, I'm so excited to chat with you, not only because of your background, your experience, but also thinking about just the transition to a lot of physical objects going on chain and what that really means for accessibility, for visibility as well, transparency. It's so fascinating. I was talking to another founder the other day, bringing other kind of digital physical assets on chain and being able to how this whole idea and ecosystem of ownership and ownership access really kind of opened up to greater population. I'm so excited to learn more about what Freeport's doing and what you're doing in terms of bringing physical objects on chain and having this whole ecosystem of fractional ownership or ownership of a small piece of an asset and what that experience means for consumers. But before we get into all that, what were you doing before you started the company?
Sure. And I share your excitement about all of those things, by the way. But before getting into Freeport, I actually worked at Apple. So I was owning marketing for Apple Cash on the Apple Pay team for the past 2.5 years. Before that, I was still at Apple, but I managed our relationships with a lot of the big issuing banks. So Chase, Wells Fargo, TD, a lot of the big boy players in that space. Before that, I was at American Express in New York City. So I've been on both coasts from New Jersey originally. But at Amex, I was on the digital partnerships and development team and helped manage partnerships with like Uber, Airbnb, other platforms where we tried to help Amex look cool. So a lot of time in the payment space, a lot of time in the sort of fintech space, but have always in the background been very, very interested in crypto and kind of the revolutionary capabilities that come along with it.
Yeah, it's so fascinating seeing a lot of people coming from a finance background and being, it seems like they're more of the early adopters to learning at least about the exposure to the technology and also the kind of the mechanics of how it might work in certain situations, even in a traditional sense for institutions that have had legacy products, the integration of that technology seems more and more kind of present, in terms of how the kind of legacy technology will transition. But what was that kind of initial curiosity? Where were you first introduced to the technology and kind of the mechanics of it? And what particularly got you excited about what tokenizing was and what crypto was and what Web3 was kind of promoting?
Yeah. So probably 13 years ago or so, I had a friend in college tell me about Bitcoin back when it was, I don't know, in the vicinity of $260 per coin, something like that. I got really excited about it. I read the white paper then, and then I read the Ethereum white paper, I don't know, like 6 or 7 years after that. And that just blew my mind, right? Like the whole concept of having this continuous ledger that is trustless, right? That's decentralized, that is publicly auditable, that is immutable. Like there are a bunch of little things that come together that are all kind of necessary for the collective chain to make sense. And once those things clicked in my head, and like it didn't hurt to make some gains on some of the early tokens, right?
Sure.
Like Bitcoin and Ethereum being early in those, that kind of amps you up a little bit, right? And you say, okay, not only do I believe in the technology, but it's also been like financially positive. Not guaranteeing that it will be for everyone, just to be super clear about that. But it really was reading those white papers and then experiencing different decentralized apps on Ethereum, especially, like going through DeFi Summer, all the different, even the ICO craze back in, I believe, 2017. So dipping my toe in and just being able to see and experience what it felt like to have different people all over the planet own similar things because they believed in similar things.
Right.
And to have that chain not be owned by some centralized entity. It's hard not to get inspired by it once you start to think intuitively about what the implications are.
Yeah. And what in particular do you think it was the benefit of being kind of in the finance space to compare the mechanic from traditional finance to what blockchain can essentially unlock with DeFi and dApps and all those things that allow people to move money and have ownership, but also do it very seamlessly and without, like you said, that centralized kind of authorities that regulate these transactions. What was it like to have that comparison, and where do you think the benefits could actually come to the larger institution if they adopt more of this technology?
Yeah. Okay. I'd say, how many degrees should I zoom out here? If I zoom out furthest and we look at it from the concept of finance is this series of abstractions that we have, right? So anything that's not sort of in your physical space currently, if you think about what a dollar is, it's kind of this abstract idea, and it allows us to represent and sort of transfer value really efficiently because we're dealing in a layer of abstraction outside of physical goods. Financial derivatives are like 5 layers of abstractions, right? It's like there's this thing of value. You can loan that thing of value out. And then like, what does this bundle of loans equate to a different level, like a different layer of abstraction? And a lot of those layers of abstraction are representative of like sort of humans and human game theory. Right? So people that are like doing stock trading or predicting, or people that are just in the financial world need to assume that humans are going to do a certain thing in the future. So finance lives in this kind of abstract space that allows predictions about what humans are going to do. Not always right, not always super effective, but that's kind of the game that you're playing. And then crypto is the next layer of that, right? So it's sort of like we have set up a new filing system for our series of abstractions that we as humans sort of operate within. And it's a much more efficient approach, and it's much more defensible against things like authoritarian takeover, or even sort of like private corporate takeover, right? So because it's a new structure that allows for these series of abstractions to interact with each other, there's a fertile growth, like a Cambrian explosion. That's kind of what I was thinking of in the space, because now we have a new structure with which to put our ideas into. So it's very similar to finance in that you're doing predictions about what humans will like, but now it's giving humans new ways to connect with each other. And then we've got to make new predictions about these different ways. So finance sets your brain up to think about things in those abstract series, and then blockchain takes it to the nth degree. More fundamentally though, like when you start to see the problems that arise in like payment tech, for instance, people think about peer-to-peer transfers are very important, like Venmo, PayPal, Cash App, Apple Cash is the product that I was working on there. It starts to become clear that there are a lot of hurdles and roadblocks and regulatory requirements that make life difficult and stickier. Not sticky in the good sense, sticky in there's a lot of friction sense. So then when you see a new sort of set of protocols that eliminate some of those frictions, you can compare it to what you've already seen in finance. You can compare it to the pain that you've seen in finance and say, oh, wait, that's a much better solution for solving X, Y, or Z problem. So there are many layers between the relationship of finance and crypto that make them complementary.
Yeah, it's so interesting thinking about, you said something about the prediction have to change, sort of kind of the new structure, this new foundation, have other people kind of creating newer behaviors within this ecosystem. When you say predictions on that behavior, is it going to change from anything that we don't know currently, or is it going to evolve? Like, what kind of predictions are changing? And if you don't mind clarifying that, and what are some of your predictions in terms of how behavior has changed already?
Sure. So there are a few places to start. One that's really obvious is NFTs, right? So like everything in the space of NFTs revolves around game theory. Hey, are people going to hype this up? Are the right people interested in this? If there's some way that I personally can hype this thing up to be to my own benefit, and then is someone else doing those things? Because if they are, then you need to respond to them. So that's sort of like the cultural art. There's this world in which art has been completely subverted because it's now on chain, and you get like absolute knowledge of how many of the asset there are and when it originated, how many people have held it, all of these things that are sort of added variables in the prediction market, right? You've got like rarity traits and things like that, but they're all absolute and on blockchain. So they drive this feeling of ownership that's much different than a feeling of ownership when it's not on blockchain. It feels more comprehensive and more sure because it's not owned by some centralized entity. So that that's a whole sort of subset of predictions that need to happen. And you can look at just Bitcoin, right? So Bitcoin is very easily predictable in that, well, we know how many there are. There are like, 19.5 million that have been minted so far. There will only ever be 21 million. So you know that the halvening is happening every few years. So you can start to make more serious predictions about the rarity. And then when you compare that to people's adoption of it, and I think recently Bitcoin has been going up as the US dollar has been faltering to some degree in the public eye. You can start to see that predicting political elements that are off of blockchain can help you decide whether or not to buy something like Bitcoin. And that's a much more casual, less volatile approach. And I know Bitcoin is still relatively volatile, but that's another sort of predictive market. Do we care that something that is on chain and will have an absolute limited amount, do we care that exists collectively as sort of like a human society? It's kind of proving out right now, and seems like we do, but that's a net new thing, right? But being able to put artificial limits on something digital, historically, you might have said, well, that's just stupid. Like those are artificial limits. Like why does the limit matter if we just place them like arbitrarily? But when you think about a lot of the things that we do in the physical world, or even like the lower layers of abstractions, we do those arbitrarily too. So we start to we start to kind of pull the threads back regarding like what is behind a US dollar, right? That's a question that's popping up now because like Silicon Valley Bank collapses. And think about like T-bills and like, are those even secure? So long-winded way of saying there are a lot of different, there are new types of predictions that can be made based upon new features that are novel to blockchain. And that's really interesting.
And it's so fascinating how kind of the other assets, the other asset classes kind of get incorporated and mixed into this. It's not just fiat. It's not just digital token. It's creating kind of this other ecosystem to assign value to something physical, which I know Freeport is working on. So fascinating. One, I love the name. First of all, for those who don't know it, please describe what Freeport is, and that the fact is it's been around for years. I mean, generations in terms of how people are having these kind of transactions with art, but also describe what's particularly interested in assigning something that's physical and tokenizing it and what that really means in terms of its ability to have kind of, I guess, community access in a way. So describe Freeport for me, because I love the name, and then describe kind of the mechanics behind bringing something physical to the chain.
So on Freeport specifically, the legacy form of a Freeport is a location that kind of sits within these tax advantage zones where people oftentimes will store incredibly valuable goods, including artwork, and they'll trade it back and forth. And they can effectively avoid paying tax in whatever the local jurisdiction is because the trades are happening within Freeports. So you end up with these locations that are just full of art or other sort of rare collectibles and valuable things that are only owned by a very few people. And they take advantage of that tax situation, let's just say. We're subverting that idea, right? So we effectively are saying, well, let's take those things that are in the Freeport right now, pull them out of it, allow folks to invest in them, right? Or really technically what we're doing is we take the asset, we give it to a company, we fractionalize that company, and we kind of securitize it. So it's almost like a mini IPO. It's not an IPO, to be clear, but it's like issuing shares, right? So you're issuing shares in a company, and the sole asset of that company is, in our case, the piece of fine art, right? And then once you have those shares, you can tokenize them, and you can display those tokens on chain, right? You can represent ownership of those shares on chain. And then you get into a lot of the different benefits and utilities that blockchain allows for as one piece. And then the other piece that we think is really important is just moving as much value that's off of the blockchain as we can onto the blockchain, because we as humans will be more efficient, right? The more value we have on blockchain, which is this kind of higher layer of abstraction than we've seen before in finance, the more that we can do things like trade one asset for any other asset, right? Like on Uniswap, you can just go trade one token for another token. It doesn't matter what the token actually represents. It's just like, well, we all have this one sort of software protocol layer, and now we can just swap things, or like the ability to just stake one token and take a loan out against it because other people recognize that token is valuable and it can act as collateral. So if all of this exists on one blockchain, and the blockchain is decentralized and not owned by one specific group, then you start to get an ecosystem that works much more efficiently with itself. So the value that we have that's off of blockchain right now, and not all value needs to be brought on chain, to be clear, but a lot of things should. When that value is on chain, then like we're all better as humans. So that's another goal that we have. I should mention, if we're going to talk specifically about the offerings, I do have to read out a quick disclosure from the SEC, and we can talk about why. Is it cool if I do that?
We're good.
Cool. All right. So here's the fun part. But an affiliate of Freeport is anticipating making an offering of securities under Tier 2 of Regulation A. No money or other consideration is being solicited, and if sent in response, will not be accepted. No offer to buy securities can be accepted, and no part of the purchase price can be received until an offering statement filed with the SEC has been qualified by the SEC. Any such offer may be withdrawn or revoked without obligation or commitment of any kind at any time before notice of acceptance given after the date of qualification by the SEC, or as stated in the offering materials relating to an investment opportunity as applicable. An indication of interest involves no obligation or commitment of any kind. And people can check out the offering circular for the offerings themselves at freeport.app. It's a lot.
Just going back to Freeport real quick, what kind of inspired the idea with all the assets that are out there? Why fine art? What in particular got you fascinated by fine art and its ability to be kind of put on chain and then fractionalized? Obviously, fractionalizing kind of assets has become popular, kind of more so as a lot of blockchain networks are allowing the possibility to do so. But what in particular got you excited about it?
Yeah. So, well, first and foremost, there's a precedent for art on chain, right? So we look at NFTs. And we can see that people understand the concept of holding something that's valuable, that's been tokenized, that is sort of aesthetically pleasing. So that's a critical element. The second is owning arts or investing in art and sort of collectively owning via these companies that we put together allows for communities to sort of grow together, right? Because you're on chain now. You can see that other people have invested in the same Basquiat or the same Warhol painting, let's just say, that was purchased on Freeport. So now you can interact with not just other folks who own the token, because it can be made visible if people so choose, but you can also then interoperate with other platforms. So to give you an example, if at some point in the future we wanted to create a building in the Sandbox or in Decentraland or any other metaverse and allow people to hang art, well, we can ensure that the only people hanging that art are the ones who own the token in their wallet, right? So it's mostly because there's precedent. It's also because like people understand the value of art. It's like, it's one of those things that's, even though it's an intangible, people feel like it is tangible. So it's, again, because there's precedent, because artwork can be visualized and then you can have it interact with different types of protocols and metaverses in an interesting way. And because frankly, it hasn't been a market that's been achievable for a lot of people outside of crypto, right? So if you want to have exposure to fine art, you generally, the fine art that does really well, let's just say, or historically has done really well, like blue chip masterpieces, you have to have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars just to spend on art. So the fractionalization and the tokenization element and bringing group ownership together around these assets that normally people couldn't get access to is a significant driver. We think we can open up a new market. We can introduce a new population of people to art who may not have been into art previously, because now they can get some skin in the game, right? So it's not just looking at it at a museum, it's really investing in the piece itself. So there are a lot of different reasons, but art seemed like absolutely one of the best places to start when it comes to bringing value on chain.
And how does that change the fine art industry in particular? Or what are some predictions or maybe even some observations you've already seen, being that it was such a privatized market? Only those who could purchase up to a certain amount were able to purchase certain pieces of art. And it really, the value of it was oftentimes not, you really didn't get a hint of it in real time. You'd always find out what something's valued at once there was a big purchase for that auction or somebody got, wind of a private transaction. How does that change kind of that dynamic of being such a privatized and kind of under a lot of mystique in terms of fine art and transactions?
Yeah, totally. I think the most recent large headline was a blue shot Marilyn, which I believe was actually shot when Andy Warhol was shot, went for $195 million either last year or the year before. Time flies during COVID. Yeah. And like, those are the things you hear of the art world though, right? Or even if you walk into a museum or a gallery currently, most people are walking in and thinking, I shouldn't be here, or there's no way that I have the right to own these things. It's really this experience. If you think about walking into an art museum, you look at the art and it's so separate from you, right? It's like, it's so like unachievable. You're just like, well, this is some other world that different people play in and not me. And we want to remove that feeling, right? So if we can remove that feeling for potential investors and they can feel like, all right, well, I can actually take part in the art world. There's no longer this invisible barrier between it and me. Then you can see this influx of people who are now comfortable becoming sort of art investors and art connoisseurs. Yeah. And that means you've got millions of people who are capable of investing in these paintings rather than just a few thousand, right? And what that does is obviously it increases demand and hypothetically at enough scale, it could increase the value of the artwork. And we think that continuing to drive in that direction is going to be like, AI art is another thing that we can talk about. We fundamentally believe that AI art is going to limit the need for real human artists. So over time, there are going to be fewer and fewer artists. And the physical artwork that does exist, like the classics that are actually representative of human interaction with the physical world, are going to continue to go up in value as well, right? We'll start to think like, what actually makes us human? What actually makes us part of our culture? And art is one of the first things that you can point to in that scenario, especially physical art that some other master has touched. So there are a lot of forces that we believe are going to be driving the art market into a much more democratized world, but will also likely increase the prices, assuming the trends that we're seeing continue. No guarantees, by the way, that anything goes up in price, but that's one of our theses.
Well, so it's fascinating also thinking about the possibilities for artists and within kind of the the voting system of blockchain and kind of how it's set up or not strategically, but the principles behind it, you could see a lot of artists potentially gaining in popularity in a world where maybe they didn't have that opportunity because a set amount of people maybe deem their art as not as valuable as another, but maybe the masses kind of can perpetuate that artist's popularity by agreeing upon the value. Have you seen any kind of surprising trends in that direction, or is mainly the assets that you have more popularized, kind of people are more well known, but kind of thinking about the artists who are emerging or maybe not as popular in the public eye, even if they have passed on, can you see that changing in terms of gaining popularity of artists that are less known today?
So 100%, I think that is the trend. And so I think the NFT world was a good indication of how people can create insular groups with like even 10 people, but 50 people, 100 people, 200, 10,000 was kind of the standard number for NFT collections. And people band together and create a community, oftentimes around an artist or around someone who may otherwise never have been heard of, right? If the idea is good enough, and they can all connect to each other and prove that they're part of the same group by virtue of owning that art together.
Right.
So the ability to create these little capsules of excitement, right, that are these like sort of mini communities will absolutely apply to artists who are doing things in the physical world right now, but might want to bring them on chain. At Freeport, we very much want to work with living artists in the future. We haven't gotten into that lane yet, but if you look at sort of like ultra modern or hyper modern art, I forget which of those it is, but it went up like 600% a few years ago, right? And these are people that like you never would have heard of before, but there's desire and there's this kind of thirst to be first, right?
Yeah.
To like get to like, even on TikTok right now, there's this trend where like you want to be liking people's things first or following them first before other folks, before they've blown up, right?
Yeah.
Because it gives you more credibility.
Yeah.
So I think all those factors are going to be working in favor of living artists right now. And again, blockchain is just one of these platforms that let you identify who your collectors are too, right? So you can see who's bought your previous art and just give them access to the next collection or maybe the third collection. And technologically, you as an artist can continue making money off of that, off of future sales. But you can also build out experiences, which are going to be revenue drivers, and they allow you to continue telling your story in different formats because your tokens can act as a gate to the experiences that you want to create for users. So it's like, if you're an artist listening out there, you'd be crazy not to be exploring the blockchain space right now.
Yeah. And I love what you talked about. And I call it kind of the mixtape phenomenon. It's when somebody wants to know the genesis of an artist at that time and point and kind of be part of that experience as they grow. And it's so fascinating that being on chain kind of allows you to have that authentic kind of not only experience, but also you have that ownership of that experience for however long in time because of when it was timestamped, right? It's like that authentic, you could prove that you were an OG listener or OG kind of art fan of a certain individual. And it's really cool how it kind of drives community. And one little bit before we go into some other questions here, it like, what does that mean? You talk about kind of micro communities and being that, I feel like historically, you had like sneakerheads who loved Jordans, right? And you kind of had this whole phenomenon fixated on one brand or one type of asset or good or service or what have you. But what does that mean now that blockchain spreads out this huge umbrella of micro ownership, and then you can have all these different communities? How do you think people will interact? I guess more of like a human philosophical question, but like, how do you think communities are going to continue to kind of be kind of boundless, and you can kind of opt in and opt out? What does that mean in terms of someone's, I'd say, allegiance to a certain community and how communities can interact?
Yeah. So I think more niche is certainly going to feel better, at least for the next few years. Yeah. There does come a point wherein you have too much choice, right? So like one of the things that Apple does really well as an example is they do limit customer choice to some degree. Mm-hmm. And it's not just so that they can control everything all the time, but it's because humans actually don't want to spend that much time making decisions. Like I would rather have 3 things to choose from than 10,000 things to choose from. So and we'll see that play out a little bit in the blockchain space too, with different like protocols, and like, it's very likely that 90% of what exists now will not exist in 2 years. Maybe less. So what I'm getting at is there will be really niche audiences. And I think that people are finding themselves in smaller communities these days because the technology does allow for it more. but we'll probably go through ebbs and flows of, I mentioned the Cambrian explosion before. If there are too many things that all pop up at once, then people can get burnt out. And that tends to be what happens when the market did what it did until a year ago when it was just absolutely crushing. Everyone sees where all the money is and it's like new thing. But I think what'll end up is that'll subside, right? And there will be fewer communities that lasts for many years, but that those communities will still be more niche and more disconnected than what we've seen historically and decentralized effectively.
What are some of the, if you take a step back, whether external or internal, what are some of the biggest risks that you think Freeport faces today?
The market is tough. We're in just a weird time, right? And you generally want to be launching when spirits are high and that everyone feels fantastic. Now, we do have the benefit of being in the tangible asset and art space, and art happens to do very, very well in times like this, which is useful for us as far as distribution goes. There are potential regulatory hurdles in the future. We've completed our review with the SEC at this point in time, which is fantastic that we've got that sort of done with. But you never know what might come on the horizon. I mean, like Elizabeth Warren just declared she's building an anti-crypto army. I don't know what that means, right? But it's a scary thing. So even if the regulation doesn't come, the threat of regulation can lead to different impacts. We wanted to accept crypto at launch as an example. We won't be able to accept crypto at launch because Signature Bank was shut down, and Signature Bank was the bank that our escrow partner uses to accept crypto payments. So like that is a kind of risk. It's not fundamental to what we're up to, right? Like we really just want to bring art to the world. We want to democratize access to it. We want to give an incredible new feeling that people haven't had before when it comes to artwork. But there's still these fringe things that can happen on the regulatory side. Now, we also, because we're going this route of Reg A and we're going to be offering these assets as securities, we do have more protections against those things, right? So like if something terrible happens to blockchain, we can still do everything that we're doing off chain. It's not like people will lose their assets. So that part is good, but it'll be a constant navigation problem for us. But that's something that we're excited to do. Right? We want to be on this frontier of what has historically been legally possible and what will be legally possible in the next couple of years. And we want to be the ones pushing that forward continuously.
I guess if everything goes well, what's the long-term vision?
My long-term vision is to have to have as many incredible collectible assets as possible that people can really invest in, right? And not just have them be owned by like the uber rich or millionaires. Create virtual experiences for those assets. So if you think about some part of the reason that the metaverse failed is because it's not totally failed yet, but like has historically failed is the things there aren't representing value yet. But imagine if there were a virtual space and the things in it correlated to things that were physical, that had real value, right? So we want to create those virtual spaces, but then we also want to create, I want to have a gallery in New York and a gallery in LA. We won't have that at launch, but for customers to be able to come in and view the artwork, like I mentioned before, not as someone who's in a museum wherein the artwork is completely unapproachable, but as someone who actually has invested in it and like owns shares in it, like a lot of the other people that will be doing the same. So creating a space that's both physical and digital, but is based in real financial groundings, again, which is why we're going through the SEC and we're not doing some like offshore Singaporean or like Bahamian organization. That's the world we envision, right? So being able to come to Freeport, having all of these assets in one place that represents the things that you own that are expensive, cool, unique things. And then being able to interact with the other people that are there as well, right? And being able to comment on other people's galleries and their collections. We're bringing all of those elements to life over time. And I think it's going to end up making ownership itself feel fundamentally different from how it feels today.
Yeah, it was amazing to see kind of ownership as a shared experience versus so kind of individual focused, going to a gallery, seeing your fractional ownership of a piece of art and then going with somebody who has another fractional a piece of another art and kind of having that conversation around it and what that kind of changes a lot of the conversation versus one-to-one transaction, and people can kind of share in that experience, which sounds so fascinating. And it's amazing kind of how that'll grow and where those communities will land and where you will think those communities grow. I would like this next section, I'll call it my founder FAQ. So I'm gonna go through some rapid fire questions and we'll see where we go. So first question I always like to ask to break it in is, what's particularly hard about your job?
there are just so many things to think about. Yeah. From a marketing perspective, a product perspective, a fundraising perspective, a legal and regulatory perspective. You need to be juggling all things at once. And generally as a startup founder, you want to be able to focus.
Yeah.
But there's just a lot to do. So having enough energy in your brain to go from one idea to the next, to the next, to the next.
Yeah.
Can be tough.
Yeah. What's particularly hard about like art sourcing, being that a lot of pieces of art are either in galleries or museums or owned by private owners? What's the challenge around art sourcing, and how are you able to, kind of get an actual asset to be able to use on Freeport and be able to kind of use on the exchange?
Yeah. It's an opaque market, right? Like prices aren't always readily available.
Yeah.
People who own pieces don't necessarily want the rest of the market to know what they own. There are shady practices that go on for sure. So like there are a lot of different elements that make it a little difficult for us.
Mm-hmm.
We were very lucky. We brought in some of the strongest advisors that exist. And so we've got Jane Holzer, who was a Warhol superstar when she was younger. She's an art collector in New York City. We have Michael Haber, who's been a Warhol dealer in New York City for 30 years at this point in time. We have an advisor who's a curator at the Pace Gallery. So we have a lot of trusted inroads that like if we just tried to start Freeport without those trusted inroads into this space, it would be a nightmare for sure. But I will say since we have been getting the word out a little bit more, we've had inbound. So someone representing an owner of a Banksy in the UK reached out and said, "Hey, can you fractionalize this Banksy?" Yeah. And it's like painting on the side of a wall that's been cut out like bricks. Yeah. Or been cut out from the building where Banksy painted it. And they want us to do that. We've spoken with other large brands that have assets, that have art assets that want us to tokenize them. So we're in a unique position in that we're taking assets that are off of the blockchain and we're putting them on chain. So if you're a Web2 company and you need a Web3 strategy, let's just say you're a VP of like X, Y, or Z company, and it's time to get into Web3, well, we have created this sort of legal infrastructure and the organizational structure such that you can take the assets that you already have and tokenize them. And then you can start to do interesting things. You can allow for your customers to invest in whatever those assets are. Yeah. You can offer experiences to your customers based upon their ownership of those tokens. So there are a lot of different possibilities that open up. So because of that, we've had more inbound than you might expect because people like the capability on the other end, right? Yeah. I have this art. How do I do cool things with it? And we do the cool thing with it. Yeah.
And what does it mean for the experience from a consumer standpoint, being that you have now this different level of attachment, say with a figure or an artist, or it could even be a corporation, and the, I guess, accountability that those artists and corporations have, because I feel like a lot of popularity is gained around knowing what you're getting and knowing where it's coming from and knowing the practices it was made, at least in goods and services. How does it change the relationship between artist and consumer of those artists in how they understand kind of the life experience, but also how they either opt in or opt out to being a fan of that particular person? Have you seen anything kind of change in terms of that relationship between the artist and the consumer?
There's a lot going on there. Because an artist can choose how much of the technology they want to interact with, or they want their consumers or their customers to interact with. Some customers may choose to display the artwork that they get from an artist out loud, and some may not like the idea that it's publicly visible within their Ethereum wallet. And there's a world in which they may be identified. So like some people want to remain pseudonymous, right? Even if they're big time collectors. So I think that there's a massive amount of functionality that blockchain allows for. And if you're a creator, you can do token gated events, or you can ask your customers to engage with their ownership in ways that you could never ask them to before. I think we're going to go through this period of kind of finding out like what people actually enjoy. Like, does privacy really matter to people? Are ZK rollups going to be critical in kind of authenticating owners without bringing to life like what their real life identity looks like? There are a lot of elements that are still playing out, but I think long term, what we're seeing right now are the foundational structures that are being built. Like the pipes are being built under the city still, right? And the buildings that are going to pop up and be frequented within that city have yet to be defined. Some of them are coming to light. Like you see a few, like Uniswap is pretty permanent now. It feels like, and Aave is pretty permanent because like the functions that they serve are like fundamental. And there are some NFT groups that seem like Yuga Labs seems to have a lot of lasting power. CryptoPunks seem to have a lot of lasting power. So you can start to look at those communities and see how those folks are interacting and continue to evolve. And I think that'll be a pretty good roadmap for defining what the long-lasting relationship might look like between creators and their communities.
Yeah. I always like to ask you some other fun questions, but I like to ask this one. What's something that you spend a lot of time on that you would like to spend less on, and something you spend little time on that you would like to allocate more to, whether it's personal or business?
I spend a lot of time worrying and partially for regulatory reasons, just because there's so many unknowns right now. So I'd like to spend less time worrying. I'd like for there to be clear regulatory guidance about what is acceptable, what's not acceptable, what is it, is Bitcoin a security, is Ethereum a security right now? We're assuming they're not, but who knows? So less time worrying for sure than I currently spend. And then more time being out in person. So a lot of what we're building is digital, and we're creating these experiences at scale because that's where we need to be at the time of launch. But I'd love to be in a physical gallery, right? Run our company out of a location where we can have actual humans come in. I am one of the rare few who I think miss having an office to go into at least 3 days a week. Let's not go too crazy. So I think physical in-person activity, activations, people should not underestimate the value of that to their health and the value to the world.
Yeah. I would like to ask this question because I love how founders extract knowledge from anything that they ingest. Whether it was early in your career or now, what books or people have influenced you the most?
This is more philosophical, but Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow.
Yeah.
He does a really good job of delineating the difference between what we're consciously thinking and what we're subconsciously thinking, and how powerful our subconscious brains are. So it's hard as someone who considers themselves thoughtful to rely sometimes on your subconscious brain. But after you train it enough times to do certain things, it can become really, really useful to just allow your subconscious brain to do things.
Yeah.
So that book was really, really insightful. It just clarifying the two sort of modes of thought.
Sure.
And letting me feel good with my, I believe it's the first system is the subconscious one.
Yeah.
That was a good one. And 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel.
Yeah.
I don't fully submit to all of Peter Thiel's, let's say, political leanings, but I do believe that so those are two books that I think back to pretty often.
I love that. And I always like to make sure, I know we're coming to the end of the show here, but I always like to make sure we didn't leave anything on the table. So is there any question I didn't ask you that I should have, or anything that you would have wanted to answer that you didn't get a chance yet? Anything you left on the table here, Colin?
No, I don't think so. People can go visit freeport.app and sign up for the wait list. That is certainly something they can do now. We'll be launching in 4.5 weeks, our first collection. So people should certainly check it out. We're going to be revamping, I think, by the time this is published, we'll have a revamped landing page that tells the story pretty well. Yeah.
And for our audience members, where can we find and support you? Give us your LinkedIn's, your Twitters, wherever is best to reach out and be a fan of yours.
On Twitter, you can find me at Colin H. Johnson. And then LinkedIn, just search for Colin Johnson Freeport. You should be able to find me. And frankly, we're small enough if people want to email me at colin@freeport.app, feel free.
Amazing.
Hopefully I don't regret that.
No, you will. We have an amazing audience. And Colin, it's been such a pleasure chatting with you, not only learning about your journey as a founder, but also what Freeport is doing to really kind of democratize its ownership of assets like fine art that would seem so out of reach for so many bits of the population, myself included. But having that not only experience to own something, but also to have a community around it, I think is so incredible. And I'm so excited to see what more assets you bring onto Freeport and how it continues to democratize this whole ecosystem of ownership and what it means to the evolution of ownership moving forward. So Colin, it's been such a pleasure having you on the show. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and thank you again for joining Behind Company Lines today.
Thank you, Julian. It's been a pleasure.
Of course.